My cousin stole my inheritance. I got the ultimate revenge at Grandpa's funeral. The words repeated in my head like a mantra as I stood at the back of the church, watching the mourners file in with their practiced sorrow and black attire. Some grief was genuine, of course. Grandpa Roy had been loved, just not by everyone who pretended to love him today. Certainly not by Bradley, who sat in the front row, shoulders squared in his tailored suit, positioned like the dutiful grandson, the rightful heir. My replacement. The church smelled of lilies and furniture polish, a scent that crawled into my nostrils and seemed to coat my lungs with something sickly sweet. My throat tightened as I watched Bradley shake hands with the pastor, his million-dollar smile in place despite the solemn occasion. 3 weeks. It had been just 3 weeks since I'd discovered what he'd done, and the wound still felt raw, a constant throb behind my ribs where my trust used to be. People nodded at me, some with sympathetic smiles, others with curious glances. Poor James, they were thinking, the wayward grandson who'd been written out of the will, the disappointment. If only they knew. The last time I saw Grandpa alive, he'd been sitting in his study, the oxygen tank humming beside him, his eyes still sharp despite how the cancer had hollowed him out. He'd taken my hand with fingers that felt like twigs wrapped in tissue paper and told me not to worry. Everything was taken care of. I was in the will. The business would go to me, just like he'd always promised. He'd raised me after Mom died, taught me everything about the family lumber company. It was supposed to be mine. Then Bradley showed up at the reading of the will 2 weeks ago, sitting across from me at Whitman's office, his face a mask of somber respect. I remember the leather chair squeaking as I shifted forward, waiting for Whitman to read the document that would honor Grandpa's wishes. But something twisted in my gut when the lawyer wouldn't meet my eyes. The entirety of the Callahan Lumber Company holdings, properties, and liquid assets are hereby bequeathed to Bradley Callahan. The words hit like physical blows. My ears started ringing. The room tilted. Bradley's face finally broke into that small, satisfied smile I'll never forget. Triumph, victory, the look of someone who had orchestrated the perfect crime. I stumbled out of that office feeling like I'd been hollowed out. The spring air felt wrong against my skin. Too warm, too alive, while everything inside me had gone cold and dead. 17 years working at the company. 17 years of learning every aspect of the business from Grandpa. All of it snatched away with a few sentences on a legal document. Now watching Bradley greet mourners with handshakes and backpats, I felt the familiar burn rise up in my chest. Not just anger. Something colder, more patient. The freezer burn of betrayal that had crystallized into purpose during these past 3 weeks. The church continued to fill, and I melted further back, away from the center aisle where I would have normally been seated with immediate family. Bradley had made sure that spot was no longer mine. My cousin, who had barely visited Grandpa during his final years, who had swooped in during those last vulnerable months when the medication made Grandpa confused and suggestible. A hand touched my elbow. Aunt Catherine, her eyes red-rimmed, but her makeup impeccable. "James, honey, why are you standing all the way back here? Come sit with the family." I felt the tremor in my hand as I placed it over hers, feeling her bird-like bones beneath paper-thin skin. She meant well. She always had, but she didn't know what her son had done. "I'm fine here, Aunt Kath." My voice came out steadier than I expected, the words flowing through the constriction in my throat. "I need some space today." The confusion in her eyes almost made me waver. Almost. But then I caught sight of Bradley looking back at us, his brow furrowed in manufactured concern. The coldness inside me solidified again. "I'll check on you after," she whispered, patting my arm before moving toward the front pews. The organ music swelled, signaling the start of the service. Everyone stood as the pallbearers brought in the casket, expensive mahogany with brass fittings, Grandpa's explicit request. I should have been one of those men carrying him to his final rest. Instead, I watched as Bradley took the front right position, his face a perfect mask of grief. During the service, my mind drifted back to the day after the will reading. The shock had worn off enough for me to start asking questions. Why would Grandpa change his will? When had it happened? The answers came from Grandpa's housekeeper, Maria, who had been with him for 20 years and had become more family than employee. "It was strange, Mr. James," she'd said, her hands nervously pleating her apron as we sat at her kitchen table. "Your cousin started coming by more after Mr. Roy began the stronger treatments. Always when you were at the office running things. Always with documents. Papers to sign." The coffee in my mug had gone cold as she spoke, telling me how she'd overheard Bradley telling Grandpa that I wanted to sell the company, that I'd been meeting with corporate buyers behind his back. Mr. Roy was so confused with the medicines. Some days he didn't know what year it was. But Mr. Bradley, he kept coming, kept whispering things. The pastor's voice brought me back to the present, his practiced cadence rising and falling as he spoke of Grandpa's legacy, his contributions to the community, his dedication to family. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. Family. The word felt hollow now. I'd spent the first week after discovering the truth in a fog of disbelief and rage. Drinking too much, sleeping too little, breaking a glass against the wall of my apartment and watching the shards scatter like the pieces of my future. But rage, I'd learned, was an unproductive emotion. It consumed energy without producing results. So I'd channeled it, focused it, spent the next 2 weeks doing what Bradley never expected me to do. Investigate, document, prepare. The eulogy came next. Bradley, of course, had volunteered. He stood at the pulpit now, solemn and poised in his designer morning clothes. The church fell silent as he began to speak, his voice catching at precisely the right moments, his eyes misting on cue. My grandfather was more than a successful businessman. He began, he was a pillar of this community and the heart of our family. My hand tightened around the folder I'd brought with me, hidden beneath my suit jacket. The weight of it against my ribs was reassuring, solid, real. Inside were the results of my 2-week crusade. Bank statements, visitor logs from the nursing staff, footage from the security camera I'd installed in Grandpa's study last year when he'd become concerned about his medication going missing. Footage I hadn't checked until it was too late, showing Bradley guiding Grandpa's trembling hand across document after document. Most importantly, the folder contained the original will, the real will that I'd found in Grandpa's personal safe, the combination to which only he and I had known. The will that left everything to me, with provisions for the family and a modest trust for Bradley. The will that had been superseded by a fraudulent document created when Grandpa was no longer competent to make such decisions. He faced hardship with dignity. Bradley continued, his voice breaking just enough to elicit sympathetic murmurs from the congregation, and taught us all that integrity is the true measure of success. My lips twitched with grim amusement. Integrity. From the man who had systematically manipulated a dying old man, poisoned him against his own grandson, and stolen a company he had no interest in running, only selling for parts to the highest bidder. I'd seen the emails on his laptop when he'd left it open during the funeral planning meeting, already reaching out to competitors about acquisition opportunities. Bradley's eulogy wound to its conclusion, and he paused for dramatic effect, gazing heavenward as if communing with Grandpa's spirit before returning to his seat beside Aunt Catherine. The pastor resumed his position, inviting anyone who wished to share memories to come forward. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The timing had to be perfect. Not before the primary eulogy, when it would seem I was trying to upstage Bradley. Not at the very end, when people would be emotionally drained and eager to move on to the reception. Now, when the floor was open, but minds were still engaged. I felt the blood rush in my ears as I stood, legs unsteady at first, then growing firmer with each step toward the front of the church. I was aware of every eye turning to follow my progress. The folder was warm against my palm, damp from my grip. Bradley's expression shifted minutely as he watched me approach. First confusion, then the barest flicker of alarm before settling into controlled neutrality. When I reached the pulpit, I set the folder down and gripped the edges of the wooden stand. The congregation before me was a sea of expectant faces. Some confused, some sympathetic, all unaware of what was about to unfold. In the front row, Aunt Catherine offered an encouraging smile. Beside her, Bradley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Thank you all for coming today," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. My grandfather was the most honest man I've ever known. I let my gaze sweep across the gathering, deliberately avoiding Bradley for now. He believed that truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. He used to tell me that when I was a boy, especially when I tried to hide some minor misdeed, a ripple of gentle laughter moved through the congregation. Good. I needed them receptive, sympathetic. The last few weeks have been difficult for all of us who loved him. Grief has a way of bringing both the best and worst out in people. It can make us reach for comfort or opportunity. Now I let my eyes find Bradley's. His posture had stiffened, the relaxed mourning facade beginning to crack at the edges. My grandfather entrusted me with many things over the years. His wisdom, his business, his confidence, but most importantly, his truth. I opened the folder, carefully removing the original will, the security camera footage on a thumb drive, and the medical records documenting Grandpa's cognitive decline during the period when the new will was supposedly created. What many of you don't know is that in his final months, while suffering from the effects of his medication, my grandfather was manipulated into changing his will. The murmurs began immediately. Bradley half rose from his seat, but Aunt Catherine placed a restraining hand on his arm, her eyes now fixed on me with dawning comprehension. I have here the original will, properly witnessed and notarized, along with video evidence showing how the fraudulent document was created. I held up the thumb drive, and Bradley's face drained of color. I also have my grandfather's medical records, which clearly show he was not of sound mind when the new will was signed. The attending physician has provided a sworn statement confirming this fact. The murmurs grew louder. I could see Bradley's eyes darting around, calculating his escape routes, weighing his options. But there were none. I'd made sure of that. I didn't come here today to disrupt my grandfather's funeral or to create a spectacle. I came to honor his true wishes and to ensure his legacy continues as he intended it. I looked directly at Bradley now, watching the mask of mourning fall away completely, replaced by naked fear. Bradley knew about Grandpa's condition. He knew about the medication's side effects. And he used that knowledge to systematically defraud not just me, but all of you who trusted him to honor Grandpa's wishes. Aunt Catherine's hand had moved from Bradley's arm to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and the first hints of betrayal. I've already filed the appropriate legal challenges to the fraudulent will. The evidence has been reviewed by the family attorney, Mr. Whitman, who is present today. I nodded toward Whitman, who stood grimly at the back of the church, his presence confirming everything I just said. But I didn't want to wait for a court to deliver justice. I wanted Grandpa's true wishes known today, in front of everyone who loved him. Because that's what he deserved. The truth spoken plainly in the presence of those who mattered to him. I placed the documents back in the folder, feeling a strange lightness spreading through my chest. The weight of the past 3 weeks was lifting with each word, the cold burn of betrayal transforming into something quieter, more resolved. Detective Harmon is also here today. I continued, gesturing to the plainclothes officer standing near the side exit. Not as a mourner, but in an official capacity. The manipulation of a mentally incapacitated person for financial gain isn't just immoral, it's criminal. Bradley's face contorted, rage breaking through the crumbling facade of grief. He lunged to his feet, pointing at me. The movement sent a surge of adrenaline through my system. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to remain still, to meet his gaze without flinching. This was the moment I'd anticipated, the public unraveling of his carefully constructed lies. You have no proof. He snarled, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the church. This is slander. You're just bitter because Grandpa saw you for what you really are. A disappointment who would have run his company into the ground. The words were meant to wound, to push me into an emotional response that would undermine my credibility. 3 weeks ago, they might have worked, but not now, not here. The evidence speaks for itself, Bradley. I replied evenly, as does your reaction. Detective Harmon had begun moving down the aisle, his purposeful stride drawing all eyes. Bradley's gaze flickered between the approaching officer and me, the calculation clear on his face. Run or fight. Neither would save him now. I trusted you. Aunt Catherine's voice cut through the tension, small but clear. You told me James was trying to sell the company. You said you were protecting Grandpa's legacy. The betrayal in her voice seemed to hit Bradley harder than any accusation I could make. For a moment, he looked genuinely stricken, a flash of the cousin I'd once known breaking through the stranger he'd become. Then his face hardened again. This isn't over, he hissed, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. Detective Harmon had reached him now, one hand hovering near the handcuffs visible beneath his suit jacket. Mr. Callahan, I need you to come with me for questioning regarding allegations of elder fraud and document falsification, the detective stated formally. The congregation watched in stunned silence as Bradley was escorted from the church, his final glance back at me filled with impotent rage. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel was there, yes, but muted beneath something more complex. A mixture of relief, vindication, and an unexpected threat of sadness for what our family had become. I turned back to the gathered mourners, many now whispering among themselves, shocked expressions on their faces. I apologize for this interruption to Grandpa's service, I said, my voice softer now. But I know he would have wanted the truth to prevail. So let's continue honoring him by remembering who he truly was, a man who valued honesty above all things. As I stepped down from the pulpit, the weight of the folder in my hand felt different. No longer a weapon but a shield. Protection against lies. Validation of truth. I moved to sit beside Aunt Catherine, who took my hand in hers, her fingers trembling but her grip firm. Did he really do those things? She whispered, her voice breaking. Yes, I replied simply. I'm sorry. The pastor resumed the service, though the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The readings continued, hymns were sung, but beneath it all ran an electric current of what had just transpired. I felt dozens of eyes on me, some sympathetic, others calculating the implications of what had happened. The business associates in the back rows were already whispering, no doubt revising their plans now that Callahan lumber would remain in my hands after all. When the service ended and Grandpa's casket was carried out to the waiting hearse, I followed as part of the family procession. The spring sun felt different on my face now, warmer, more present. The air filled my lungs more easily than it had in weeks. The cemetery was only a short drive away, a family plot where generations of Callahans rested beneath ancient oaks. I drove alone, windows down, the scent of fresh-cut grass drifting in with the breeze. At the graveside, I stood with Aunt Catherine as the casket was lowered into the ground. Her hand remained in mine, a silent acknowledgement of what we'd both lost and found today. When it came time to throw the traditional handful of dirt, I stepped forward last, after the other mourners had moved back toward their cars. I kept my promise, Grandpa, I whispered, letting the soil trickle through my fingers onto the polished wood below. The company stays in the family. The real family. The sound of the dirt hitting the casket was surprisingly loud in the quiet cemetery. Final, conclusive. As people began to disperse, many approached me with handshakes and embraces that felt more genuine than those I'd received at the church. Word had spread quickly. Judgments had been revised. The wayward grandson was now the wronged heir who had fought for justice. The narrative had shifted, but that wasn't why I'd done it. I'd done it because Grandpa deserved better than to have his last wishes corrupted. Because the business he'd built deserved better than to be dismantled for quick profit. Because the truth, as he'd always taught me, deserved to be spoken. The reception was held at Grandpa's house. My house now, according to the original will. As I moved through the rooms, accepting condolences and fielding questions about the future of the company, I felt a strange sense of Grandpa's presence. Not in some mystical way, but in the framework of ethics he'd built within me. The foundation that had given me the strength to fight back when it would have been easier to simply walk away. Later, when most guests had left and only close family remained, I found myself in Grandpa's study. The oxygen tank was gone, but his presence lingered in the worn leather chair, the shelves of books, the faint scent of his pipe tobacco that no amount of cleaning would ever completely remove. On his desk sat the model of the first sawmill, hand-carved by his father, my great-grandfather. 3 generations of Callahans had guided this business. Now it would continue under my stewardship, just as Grandpa had planned. Aunt Catherine found me there, 2 glasses of Grandpa's favorite bourbon in her hands. She looked older than she had this morning, the events of the day etched into new lines around her eyes. I should have seen it, she said, handing me one of the glasses. All the signs were there. He's your son, I replied, accepting the bourbon. You trusted him. We all did. She sank into the chair across from me, staring into her glass as if it might contain answers to questions she was still forming. What happens to him now? The question hung between us, heavy with implications. Mother and son. Justice and mercy. The past and the future. That depends on whether he cooperates, I said after a moment. The evidence is clear, but if he returns everything, admits what he did, the charges could be reduced. And if he doesn't, then he'll face the consequences of his actions. Just like Grandpa always taught us. She nodded slowly, taking a sip of her bourbon. Roy would be proud of you, James. Not for the revenge, though God knows Bradley deserved it, but for standing up for the truth. We sat in companionable silence for a while, the setting sun casting long shadows through the study windows. The day's events replayed in my mind, not with the sharp edges of recent trauma, but with the softened perspective of something already becoming memory. My cousin stole my inheritance, and I got the ultimate revenge at Grandpa's funeral. But it wasn't revenge that filled me now as I sat in what was rightfully my grandfather's study, preparing to carry forward his legacy. It was something quieter, something that felt like peace. The company would continue. The truth had been spoken. Justice had been served not through violence or matched cruelty, but through the simple, devastating power of evidence laid bare before those who needed to see it. In the end, that was the revenge that mattered. Not the public humiliation of Bradley or the restoration of my inheritance, but the vindication of Grandpa's trust in me, the preservation of his true wishes, the continuation of what he'd built. As darkness fell and the last mourners departed, I remained in the study, surrounded by the artifacts of Grandpa's life. Tomorrow would bring challenges, restructuring the company, legal proceedings against Bradley, rebuilding relationships with clients who'd been told I was selling out. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of truth finally spoken, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of both loss and victory. Grandpa was gone. His company, our company, would continue. And somewhere between those two certainties lay the understanding that some inheritances go beyond what can be written in a will or measured in dollars. The true inheritance was in how he'd shaped me, how he'd taught me to fight for what was right, even when, especially when, it was difficult. I raised my glass to the empty chair behind the desk, a silent toast to the man who'd shown me that real justice doesn't shout. It simply inevitably arrives.